So now that you have some drafted questions for you to look at and think about, I want to talk about some best practices for actually writing qualitative research questions. One of the first things that I want you to do is to plan for a conversation. So I want you to think about how to ask questions in the same way that, or a similar way that you would ask of your friends. So think about how you would get a friend to talk about asking for an excused absence, for example. These conversations and qualitative interviews in general are usually relaxed. There are some exceptions, but we're not really going to deal with those now. So think about a casual conversation. And along with that, you want to avoid technical language and unfamiliar jargon. So, you can imagine a situation in which I'm trying to figure out how two things are related. And if I asked about, could you explain to me the causal mechanism of how A results in B? Your interviewee might be like, what's a causal mechanism? Right? So you want to avoid any language that, for example, is too sociological or technical. You also don't want to ask your research question. And the reason for this is your research question is probably grounded in larger social science interests or interests in your discipline, your area of expertise, and isn't something that your interviewee can easily answer. For example, our question for the Student Excuses Project of what are student experiences with asking for excused absences and extensions on assignments isn't easily translated into an interview question. So imagine I'm talking to you and I ask, so what are your experiences in asking for excused absences and extensions on assignments? How would you answer that? What do you mean, what are my experiences? I have a variety of different experiences, right? It's kind of overwhelming. I also did another project where I looked at how judges in a particular kind of court made decisions. And if I had just come out and said, how do judges make decisions? Again, people wouldn't really know how to ask that question. So I want you to think about other ways to come at the topic and break the topic down into smaller pieces that are more easily digestible. The next thing I want you to think about when you're formulating your questions is to think about what is interesting or important from the participant's perspective. So what are they going to want to talk to you about, and what kinds of stories will they likely want to tell you? And one of the ways, if you're really struggling with this, one of the ways to really try to come at this is to actually ask someone else to ask you the questions you've been planning, right? And, you can just do this as kind of a relaxed conversation, but do it with a friend. And if they start asking you some of the questions that you have written out, it'll help you to think like, oh, but this is the other thing I want to talk about, or I really wish I'd been asked this, right? So try it, but try to think about, put yourself in the interviewee's position and try to think like, what are they going to be interested in telling you about? Or what's important to them? And then try to formulate questions that prompt those ideas. In terms of wording your questions, one of the things that I want you to be careful about is asking questions that begin with what or how. What questions can get people to describe specific events? So what happened when you asked for an extension on an assignment, right? That's going to prompt a person to tell you a story, which is what we want. How questions help you get a process. So how did you decide that you were going to ask for an excused absence in this case? Or how did you decide not to ask for an excused absence, right? So how will help you get to the process of how someone decided to make a decision. But one of the things I want you to be really careful with here is not asking why, all right? And the main problem with a question of when you ask why is that it implies judgment. So if I say, why did you ask for an excuse that time? Right? The subtle implication there is that you should not have, and so I want you to now account for what you should not have done. Right? Why did you decide to skip class on a certain day? Right? Again, it just feels uncomfortable when someone asks why, um, because it implies that you shouldn't have done or said what you did. So I want you to go through your questions and to look for places where you might have asked why and just reword them. Turn them into a what or how question. I also want you to work on keeping these questions open-ended. So check to make sure you don't have questions that, especially like either or questions, like, have you asked for an excuse? Yes or no, right? If I say yes, where do I go from there? If I say no, where do I go from there, right? It's going to require some additional questions and follow up. So work on trying to come up with questions that will allow the interviewee to tell you what happened and what is important to them. So look for those close-ended questions.